You've definitely seen these artworks before. Whether it's through promotional materials, the trading cards, or straight up the box art for these games, the first 251 Pokemon were depicted in this distinct watercolor art style. These paintings, made by Ken Sugimori, remain a huge part of Pokemon's history. Today, we're investigating this art style and figuring out what tools he could have used and what techniques were utilized in order to achieve its classic look. I'll be teaching you the basics of watercolor, and at the end of this video, we'll be making our own paintings in this style for you and everyone else to judge. That's right, welcome back to Render Breakdown. Hey everyone, it's Thomas. Welcome back to another episode of Render Breakdown. Render Breakdown is a show where we study popular video game artworks, break down its art style, then try our best to replicate it in the end. Pokémon celebrates its 29th anniversary this year, and with that, I thought it'd be interesting to do a bit of a throwback to some of the most iconic artwork from the series. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. Ken Sugimori states in a developer interview back in 2000, translations provided by Shmooplations, quote, "Initially, we talked about a game where you made kaiju fight each other. Alright, I said, I'll try drawing some kaiju then. But I realized I had never drawn monsters like that before. I just tried to draw kaiju-ish monsters but in a more cartoonish, exaggerated style. As I drew more and more of them, I started to figure out how to give them more interesting expressions or to make them look more dopey or disgusting." End quote. And you can definitely see the kaiju influence in these initial illustrations. While it's not completely there because of the cutesy, dopey art style, these initial designs definitely lean more into its monster aspect, especially when compared to what they eventually turn into. Broadly, I would say that Pokemon's design philosophy overall is cutesy. For the most part, these are simplified, cartoony takes on already existing plants, animals, foods, objects, which makes sense since this game is primarily marketed towards children. Little fun fact, did you know that Pikachu was originally designed by Atsuko Nishida after Daifuku? It's a Japanese dessert, a mochi ball with red bean paste filling. This is why initial depictions of Pikachu have them round and chunky. Alright, let's take a look at the finalized artworks themselves. I know studying art in general can get a little overwhelming, especially when it comes to collecting references and whatnot. At least for me it is anyway. I find that a good way to compartmentalize all this information is by visually presenting them through something like a mood board. So for this segment, we're doing it a little bit differently with today's sponsor, Milanote. It's a great tool for organizing your creative projects, and it's free. I can save my references here really easily and reduce the clutter, instead of just having them opened as a web page or a document. You can also make it link back directly to your source, which is really handy when you want to see more of the artist's body of work and you don't want to lose track of who to credit. As artists, we naturally tend to be visual learners, so a tool like this is genuinely so helpful to keep things organized in a way that makes sense to you. Right here, I've listed down my observations of the rendering style's characteristics. I can intuitively point out what parts of the artworks I'm referring to. You can write notes, draw on it, make checklists, attach videos, and so much more. You can even further organize your project into several different subboards if you need to, all in one place. If you're working on a collaborative project, you can also easily share your boards with other people for them to leave feedback and work together on the board in real time. Again, Milanote is available for free with no time limit, so sign up today for a Milanote account using my link in the description. Thank you to Milanote for sponsoring this video. Genuinely, what a great tool. Alright, I've prepared my art style observations in a convenient list form for you to chew on. As mentioned earlier, these monsters have an overall cute and cartoony look to them. There's a sort of roundness to these designs, even in characters that are supposed to be spiky. Obviously, they come with line art, but something you might not have noticed is how irregular the line width is. Look at how much the stroke varies in weight, and how misshapen and imperfect they are. This tells me that the lines were probably drawn with something like a brush pen instead of a pen or a marker. These are painted using watercolor. You can tell because of how splotchy and cloudy the colors are. Technically, you can achieve a watercolor look with markers as well, so I did consider it for a minute, but I think it would have produced a sharper edge and a more vibrant look, which this art style generally does not have. These are painted using the wet-on-wet watercolor technique. We'll talk more about that later on in the video. Lastly, there is a strong light source that is coming from the top left. These highlights are defined through the absence of color, which means the white that you see here are from the blank spaces of the paper itself. It gives these artwork a sort of sheen effect, and I think this aspect is what really defines the Sugimoni Pokemon watercolor look. And here's what the art style would look like if we turn it into a material sphere. I want to preface this section by saying that everything I'm saying in this video is only based on my observations and are only educated guesses. I tried my best to look for interviews of Sugimoni talking about his watercolor art process, and while I can find interviews of him talking about designing the monsters themselves, I can't actually find interviews about his art process specifically with watercolor. If I somehow missed this, then please feel free to let me know down in the comments below. Otherwise, take everything I say with a grain of salt. But I do have rationales for why I think the way I do, and yeah, I could still be wrong, whatever. Anyways, let's talk about the tools we'll be using in this video, starting with the paper. It might not seem all that important, but it can change the way your art can look. There are three kinds of watercolor paper: rough, cold pressed, and hot pressed. Rough watercolor paper is, as the name suggests, it's rough, and when you paint on it, it leaves this granular texture behind. It absorbs water well, so you have more control over how it spreads. Personally, not a big fan of this one, but you know, to each their own. Hot pressed paper, sometimes called smooth pressed, is on the opposite spectrum. It's very smooth, and it takes time for the water to take in. If you want a cleaner look to your art, this is what you'll be using. However, it can be a little difficult to control because the water stays and can shift around the paper longer than the other paper types, which sometimes can cause some unintended spillage. Finally, cold pressed paper. This sits as a happy medium between the previous two. It still got some textures on it, but not as intense. Judging by how Sugimoni's art looks, it looks to me that he might be using hot pressed paper. It doesn't have any of the white textures that signify that it's rough or even cold pressed paper. Here are some of my tests on the different papers. If you don't have access to hot pressed watercolor paper specifically, you can always use the backside of the other watercolor types. They're generally just as smooth as the hot pressed ones, and you know, it's not the exact same thing, but come on, it's good enough. Next up, let's focus on inking. As I mentioned earlier, I suspect that this is inked using a brush pen. The lines to me look a little bit too organic to be a marker, especially with how they taper at the ends. Here is a sample of my lines using a fine liner against ones I made using a brush pen. Here is a sample of Ken Sugimoni himself making art using markers. The difference is clear to me, so I went on my merry way, started inking my sketch, but unbeknownst to me, there was a problem. Brush pens aren't waterproof, and I found this out the hard way. I went into this painting with the idea that I'd be able to reuse one of the brush pens that I used in one of my previous videos, which is Metal Gear Solid. Fun video, by the way, go check it out. Unfortunately, it seems I was wrong. So I figured I had a couple of options. One, I could stick to fine liners, which I've tested and they don't smudge in water, but it really looks wrong to me. I even had a bit of a back and forth with an artist friend that I consulted about this. Two, I could stick with the brush that I currently have, but I'd have to apply it after I do the watercolor, which looks fine honestly, but I know it's wrong, because based on some of these illustrations, it seems like Sugimoni inks these illustrations before he does watercolor. You can see this in how some of the colors bleed over the line art. Luckily, there was a third option. I found out after a bit of research that the Pentel Pocket Brush Pen is waterproof, and that's exactly what I needed. So I ordered it and waited. Let's move on to the watercolor itself. The paint I'm using is from Reeves. It's the 12-pack one. It's not the most fancy watercolor out there, but honestly, it does its job and it's fairly inexpensive. I got this for less than $10 in one of my local art shops, though I did buy this years ago. So I don't know how much it is in present day money. I just found this sitting in my storage and was like, okay, fuck. Still, just get some cheap ass watercolor paints out there. I'm sure it'll be fine. But I do advise against buying like one of those cheap watercolor pans where it's like, it looks like makeup. Because it's much easier to mix your pigments using these tube paints. A lot more consistent and they're a lot more pigmented as well. Generally, it's better bang for a buck, in my opinion. If you're not super familiar with watercolor, don't worry about it. I personally think that watercolor is one of the easiest paint mediums to get into. It's a little unforgiving if you make a mistake, but it's also really easy to, you know, get back to where you were if you start over. The basic principle here is that you want to paint from light to dark, which means we'll begin with some light washes first. Here are the brushes that I'm using for this. I've got a standard round tip brush. It's a bit big. This one's from Berkeley. I've also got these two water brush pens, which you can fill up with water, so you can squeeze some water out of your brush in case you need to wet your paper more. As always, you don't need to have these brushes exactly, just make sure that they're intended for watercolor. Usually they're made of synthetic material like nylon. Otherwise, if you use brushes that are not made for watercolor, they're going to look bad and you're going to feel bad. I mentioned earlier that we're using a technique called wet on wet. This means we're pre-wetting parts of the paper before we apply the paint on them. The reason we're doing this is because we want the edges of our colors to be cloudy and sort of faded out like these original paintings. So, for example, I want to paint the brown parts of Eevee's body. With my big round tip brush, I'm going to fill out the parts that I want to paint with just plain old water. I'm being a little generous with the amount of water I put on it so that when I apply the paint, it's going to spread out and look nice. Apply the watercolor in dabs. Be careful about adding too much pigment right from the get-go. We want to leave blank spaces on the page for our highlights. Unlike other traditional paints or even digital painting, you can't really hide your mistakes by painting over it because watercolor is far too thin to provide actual coverage. That's why we don't normally use white paint to paint white spaces. We leave them blank. That said, don't be afraid to fuck up sometimes. It's okay to make mistakes. Personally, I'm the kind of guy who likes to figure things out by trial and error. I have a lot of these failed watercolor attempts right here. That's just kind of the whole nature of Render Breakdown as a series. Watercolor is all about learning brush control. If we don't pre-wet the paper, otherwise called wet on dry, the colors will have well-defined solid edges. We'll also be using this technique in these paintings. You can see that some of these artwork have a bit of that faint, almost cel-shaded shadow to them, but that means we'll have to wait for the initial wash to dry and settle first. Here's my practice illustration of Eevee, which I referenced off of the official one by Sugimori. To recap this entire section, here's a list of all the tools that I used in this video. Reeves Watercolor 12 pack, 12x12 hot pressed watercolor paper, Pentel Pocket brush pen, some round tip nylon watercolor brushes, a pencil and eraser for sketching. Before we continue, leave a comment saying, "Thomas, there's a white hand on your shoulder," because if you don't, well, nothing will happen. Sorry for engagement baiting. I'm trying to get to 50k, yada yada yada. You get the point. Anyways, this is the part where we actually draw things. I asked you guys over here on YouTube, as well as on my Discord, which Pikachu clone is your favorite? And by a landslide, your favorite ghost-type Pokemon, Mimikyu, is the winner of both polls. Now, I came across a unique challenge when designing this Pokemon. Mimikyu is a Gen 7 Pokemon, which means it was released in Pokemon Sun and Moon. Pikachu used to be like really round and chunky, and now Pikachu's like very thin. And I feel like since Mimikyu is based on Pikachu, that the design will be a little bit different as well. So I made two Mimikyu illustrations. First off, I drew Mimikyu as normal. You know, this is just Mimikyu as Mimikyu appears in the Gen 7 games and onwards. Same design, you know, Mimikyu is like a sort of fake puppet thing that the Pokemon underneath wears in order to look like Pikachu. In terms of posing, I wanted to make this Mimikyu look a little bit more dynamic than just, you know, its usual standing pose. I never want to make these illustrations have the same pose as the original artworks, just so, you know, I can differentiate these artworks and make it my own a little bit. So I decided to have Mimikyu have its hand out, you know, that it uses normally to attack, to say hello a little bit to the viewer. Alright, so this is me pre-wetting the paper, like parts of it, so we can do the wet on wet technique onto the painting, like so. And this is how it turned out. And now for the fun version of Mimikyu. So this version of Mimikyu, you know, I thought about designing this. What if Mimikyu was released in Gen 1? So one of the first things I did was obviously make this Mimikyu like chubbier than normal Mimikyu because, you know, old Pikachu was chubby. I pulled people from my Discord and asked them which Mimikyu redesign looked better because I was having a bit of a struggle with like Mimikyu's face itself. I don't know, I tried to draw the lion eyes like it is in the original, but it doesn't really look like Gen 1 to me. I don't know, is this just me? Yes, there are Pokemon like Clefairy and Togepi who have this kind of eye, but they have this highlight on them, and Mimikyu's eyes like don't have that. I don't know, it just looked wrong to me, and so I opted to make Mimikyu's eyes look more like ghastly a little bit, or like tentacruel, menacing eyes that are hiding behind the cloth. You can see that it still has the little drape over it like the original Mimikyu, but I drew it in a way that's like more flowy, something like Jinx's dress. The other most glaring difference between my Mimikyu design and the original are the eyes on the doll itself. In the original, these are spiral shapes drawn with a marker. I opted to go with something more simple. I based this off of the substitute doll, which looks like this. And I think that it fits, the concept of Mimikyu being a doll really well. As for Mimikyu's red cheeks, in the original design, these are also drawn with a marker, but, red this time. I decided to go in a different direction and go with a more shoddy patchwork look. It's meant to be like there's a hole in the fabric and you put cloth on top of it and you sew it on like really raggedy like, and you see a bit of the thread poking out. I just think it's a good look for it, and I think I like how it turned out. For Mimikyu's tail, instead of having a wooden stick that Mimikyu holds on to the whole time, which, I always found that a little bit weird even in the original design, I opted to go with just having Mimikyu stick its arm out and have the arms be the tail. I decided to make the hands a bit more realistic looking, make it look like an actual claw. I based this off of Haunter, something I noticed about design philosophy differences between classic Pokemon and modern Pokemon is that older Pokemon tend to be more detailed in terms of anatomy, which isn't really a bad thing. It's just a difference of design philosophy and modern trends and whatnot, and there's been a lot of artists for Pokemon, I imagine, so it's only natural that like art styles would change and stuff like that. But yeah, it makes for an interesting study. And this is how it turned out. I believe that feedback is an important part of the creative process, which is why I post my work online to see what people think, so maybe I could make adjustments and, people can point out my blind spots and stuff like that. And it seems like a lot of people really resonated with my work over on Reddit. I'm happy to have 6.4k upvotes at the time of me recording this, and a lot of people have a lot of things to say, there's a lot of positive comments about this looking like Gen 1 or maybe Gen 2, which is really what I'm going for. And there's a lot of comments as well saying that maybe my Mimikyu design should have been a little bit more fatter, which I agree with in hindsight. I just felt like it's easier to articulate Mimikyu in this way, but maybe I can like adjust this in the future if I ever go back to doing more Sugimori style watercolor artwork, if that's something you're interested in. Really happy to have all these positive feedback, so thank you so much. If you like this video, then you might like my other ones. Go check out my episode on Club Penguin, where I interview former Club Penguin artists and we have a little bit of a chat and they judge my work at the end of the video. It's real fun, it's real special, go check it out. Thank you to these wonderful channel patrons, especially Niall Price, I Am Anouk, and Alejandro Toribio. They've been around for a long time. Thank you so much. If you're interested in downloading project files like PSDs and clip files from the show, you can go join their ranks over on Patreon. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and yeah, let me know what video game art style you want to see me do next. I think you will like the next episode. You'll never see it coming, as they say. But until then, ciao. I'll see you on the next one.